Picture this, February 1945. World War II is grinding to a close. Three men gather in a grand palace in the Crimea to basically draw the map of the post-war world. But this was no friendly meeting. It was a showdown of ideas, of power, with the very future of Europe hanging in the balance.
And that right there, that's the brutal, chilling logic of Joseph Stalin. For him, this wasn't just about winning a war. It was about expansion. It was about remaking the world in his image. This quote just perfectly lays out the cold, hard reality the West was about to come face to face with. And who was staring right back at Stalin across that table? None other than Winston Churchill, a man who had built his entire career fighting the very ideology that was now about to swallow half of Europe. So this is the story of that incredible collision. A lifelong crusader forced into a room to cut a deal with the one man who stood for everything he hated. To really get what was at stake at Yalta, you have to understand the sheer depth of Churchill's hatred for communism. I mean, this wasn't just some political disagreement for him. This was a fight for the soul of civilization itself.
Just listen to the words Churchill uses here. He doesn't just disagree with Bolshevism. He sees it as a biological threat. It's a disease, a pestilence. In his mind, this was a plague that had to be wiped out, not something you could ever negotiate with.
And this metaphor, this idea, it ran deep. He saw the very birth of the Soviet state as an act of, well, biological warfare. He argued that the Germans didn't just send a political radical back to Russia in 1917. They knowingly unleashed a plague bacillus to infect and destroy an entire nation from within.
And the language gets even more raw, even more visceral. He literally strips the Bolsheviks of their humanity, calling them ferocious baboons. You see, he didn't view them as political opponents. He saw them as a destructive, almost subhuman force that was tearing down civilization. This wasn't just rhetoric. This is what he truly believed.
So here's the kicker. Even after fighting a brutal 4-year war against Germany, Churchill came to this shocking conclusion. Bolshevism was an even greater evil. He thought its tyranny was far worse, far more destructive than anything the Kaiser had thrown at them. And that belief sets up the impossible situation he's about to face at Yalta.
All right, so let's fast forward to February 1945. Churchill, the ultimate anti-Bolshevik, shows up at this palace in Yalta. But this is where his lifelong crusade is about to slam headfirst into the immovable wall of Soviet military power.
The conference was a complete whirlwind. We're talking 8 intense sessions packed into just 7 days. This was it, the last time the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, would ever meet. Germany was about to collapse, and these three men were there to decide the fate of millions. And here's where the trouble starts. They all wanted completely different things. Roosevelt, who was very sick and just months away from death, was laser-focused on his big ideas, creating the United Nations and getting the Soviets to help finish the bloody war against Japan. Stalin, he wanted one thing above all else, a buffer zone of friendly countries on his western border. And Churchill, he was there to stop Stalin.
And this was Churchill's absolute nightmare. Remember what Stalin said at the very beginning? Whoever occupies a territory imposes their system. Well, by the time they all sat down at Yalta, the Red Army was already there. Stalin wasn't asking for Eastern Europe, he already had it. Churchill's passionate words were up against millions of Soviet soldiers on the ground.
If there was one issue that completely consumed the conference, it was Poland. For Britain, the whole war had started to defend Poland's freedom. For Stalin, Poland was the key to Soviet security. It became the ultimate test, the soul of the entire conference.
Stalin laid it out in brutally simple terms. He argued that for Russia, Poland wasn't just some country. It was a matter of life and death. It was the highway that invaders had used to attack them time and time again. He was going to shut that highway for good, and he was not going to back down.
So the problem boiled down to this. There were basically 2 different Polish governments. The West recognized the government in exile, the guys who had fled to London. But Stalin had already set up his own puppet government in a city called Lublin, run by Polish communists. So who was going to be in charge? That was the deadlock. So, after days and days of arguing, they finally reached a compromise. But it was a compromise built on a foundation of sand. It was built on words that meant completely different things to the men saying them.
Okay, so here's what they hammered out. First, Poland's eastern border would be moved way to the west, giving a huge chunk of land to the Soviet Union. Second, the Soviet-backed government would be reorganized to include a few democratic leaders from the outside. And third, and this is the big one, Stalin promised to hold free and unfettered elections as soon as possible. On paper, it looked okay, maybe a little messy, but salvageable.
But here's the fatal flaw, the million-dollar question, isn't it? What do words like free elections actually mean to a dictator who had spent his entire life crushing any and all opposition? Well, the answer to that question would come very, very quickly, and it would blow the Grand Alliance to pieces.
The ink was barely dry on the agreement when Stalin started putting his version of it into action, and any hope for a free and democratic Eastern Europe just evaporated, almost overnight.
Stalin's interpretation was swift and brutal. The reorganized Polish government? A total sham. Communists kept all the real power. Those free elections, they were delayed, they were rigged, and in some places they never even happened. By 1947, just 2 years later, it was a done deal. One-party communist states were running Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. The promises made at Yalta were utterly meaningless.
And just look at how fast the alliance fell apart. Roosevelt dies in April. By the next big conference in Potsdam in July, the whole mood had changed. The trust was gone. And then, just over 1 year after Yalta, Churchill, now out of power, gives that famous speech declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Cold War was on.
So we're left with this huge, messy question that historians have fought over ever since. Did Roosevelt and Churchill sell out Eastern Europe? Or were they just realists, forced to accept a military fact they couldn't change? That the Red Army was there, and only starting World War III was going to move it. Yalta may not have started the Cold War, but it was absolutely the moment the lines were drawn. Not on a map, but in the unbridgeable gap between freedom and total control.